Are the Aussie teams stronger in Super Rugby this year, folks? When the Melbourne Rebels got cut at the end of Super Rugby last year, I think that was the hope. The talent would be spread out between fewer teams, which would mean stronger performances from the remaining four Aussie sides. And with the Lions tour on the horizon, how strong have they been? Let's compare the 2025 numbers to 2024 to see if there is any noticeable difference between the performance levels of the sides. And you guys can let us know your thoughts on how the Aussies have been looking. The way they finished on the log is actually pretty similar to last year, albeit with only four teams. The Brumbies finished third again. The Reds finished fifth again, so these are the two playoff teams. The Tarzan, eighth, is not good enough for the playoffs this year. It would have been last year. The Rebels finished eighth and did make the playoffs, but with the reduction of teams to 11 from 12, they cut the playoff teams from 8 down to 6. So the Tars miss out in 8th and the Force miss out in 9th. So 50% of the teams made the playoffs from the Aussie point of view this year, whereas it was 60% last year, but there were more teams in the playoffs. So it's a pretty similar result, I feel like, in terms of the number of teams that made the playoffs. And there was talk throughout the season about the quality of the competition and have the New Zealand teams weakened a lot, because for a large period, all four of these teams were actually in contention for the playoff spots. There were only two New Zealand teams in the playoff spots for much of the season, but the way the draw worked meant the Aussie teams didn't have to travel to this side of the ditch quite as much early on, and the early games they did manage to hold against the Kiwi opponents. But how did it pan out across the course of the season? Well, if we look at 2025's pure win-loss ratio for the Aussie sides up against the Kiwi sides, for which I am excluding Moana Pacifica. You can argue whether they're a New Zealand team or not, but I'm mainly looking at the key 5 New Zealand franchises. It's 60 to 35, with one draw there being the extra 5%. So the Kiwi teams have still had the wood over the Aussie teams in 2025, and it's not actually too different from the numbers in 2024. If we stick 2024's numbers up alongside, it was 58-42. So if the Force are able to convert that draw into a win, it is the ultimate much of a muchness between 2024 and 2025. But with that draw, it actually means 2024's numbers were kind of slightly better in terms of pure win-loss ratio for the Aussie sides. But I do think we need to kind of break it down a little bit more into where the games were played, because in 2025, we only saw a couple of Aussie wins over here on New Zealand soil. Again, if we're excluding the Moana Pacifica games, the Brumbies got a win over here against the Blues, and there was a win down in Dunedin for, I think it was the Reds. So largely wins over on New Zealand soil against those 5 New Zealand franchises proved tough. Home results for the Aussie guys were certainly a lot better. They were able to hold relatively strongly on home soil. 2024's numbers are a fair bit more complicated in that regard, because we had Super Round. 3 of the New Zealand teams, the Crusaders, Chiefs and Hurricanes, all had home games in Melbourne for Super Round. So those were 3 games that didn't have to be played on this side of the Tasman for an Aussie team. So the win-loss ratio overall is pretty similar to 2025, like I mentioned, but what we do see is fewer Aussie away losses over here. I think it's partly because a few more of the games were played at that kind of neutral venue, like I said. We still did have 2 Aussie wins on New Zealand soil that year. The Crusaders dropped a game at home, and I think it was the Highlanders again. The Crusaders had a terrible record against the Aussie teams last year. They dropped both their games against the Waratahs, and the Waratahs were awful in 2024, so it's been something of a turnaround. But the overall kind of home and away stuff makes for largely pretty similar reading, with wins on this side of the Tasman being kind of hard to come by. But what about the points difference? Have the games actually been closer, or have they been further apart, even if the overall results have been largely pretty similar year on year? In 2025, the average score between the New Zealand and Aussie teams when they met was 35-25. So it's a 10-point average difference, with the New Zealand teams being 10 points to the good. 2024, it's a 9-point difference. The scores are a bit lower. Average score 31-22, so fewer points scored, fewer points conceded from an Aussie point of view. But the points difference being 9 is 1 better than it was in 2025, where it was 10. So to be honest, folks, the number of teams that make the playoffs goes from 60% to 50%. The average points difference goes from 9 to 10. The average win-loss ratio goes from 58-42 to 60-35 plus a draw. Honestly, it is all much of a muchness. There is not a huge difference between the results in 2024 and 2025. Partly, I think that's the Waratahs refinding their feet. They had to make a whole heap of signings, which it's always hard to kind of get these guys to gel together into a cohesive unit. I do feel like the Force have had an issue with that for more than one season now. They often seem to have kind of a higher staff turnover or player turnover than some of the other sides. The Brumbies have still been pretty consistent, and the Reds have had, I think, a pretty decent year as well, even if they didn't finish the year as strongly as they started. But are the Aussies better in 2025? I think they're pretty similar to 2024, but I still think they should be competitive enough to give the Lions a wee go. You guys let us know your thoughts. If you want any Wallabies gear, Wallabies store is an affiliate of the channel, so check the official Wallabies store down in the description if you want to get some gear ahead of the British and Irish Lions tour. You guys take care of yourselves. Where do you see the Aussie teams being at? How do you think the Wallabies are going to go? Take care. Talk to you guys again soon. See you later.